Here we go. Hello and
Test,
welcome.
test.
Yeah, we're testing.
All right.
Is
We're
our
hearing stuff.
audio is our audio working?
Hearing reports that it's working.
Perfect. Hi, welcome to Heart, where I talk to people who make video games. And we're here today with Troupe, who is our audio lead at Heart Machine on Solar Ash. And he's going to tell us all about smashing bottles and hitting drums and all that wacky stuff that audio leads do. Hi,
Yeah.
Troupe.
Hey, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on board. Um, our format here, just for folks who've never watched, or if you need a reminder, because it's been a little bit since we've been on here, is we'll share some insights into different aspects of creation of a game from the person's perspective, the guest's perspective, and specifically in this case on the audio side, whether it's composing music or creating some of the more complicated systems. We'll be talking about other audio folks on the team as well, not just Troupe, because there's a whole crew there. And then we'll do some Q&A afterwards. So try and keep it to about 40 minutes or so of going through these things, maybe less if we're brisk. And then we can open it up to folks to chat all the live long day. So, Troupe, hello again and welcome, and thanks for joining. Can you do a very brief introduction of yourself? Who the hell are you?
Yeah. Well, I'm Troupe Gammage. I'm from Austin, Texas. I've been making games and game music for about 20 years at this point, and in a professional context for about 15 years. And I started on this project as a sound designer, and then I have sort of evolved over. I think I've been on the game about 3.5 years, um, and I've done music. I've done some voice stuff, and kind of officially, I'm the audio lead of Solar Ash.
It's true. It's your title. It's in a spreadsheet, so that makes it true.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen it on the credits. It's there.
It's in the credits. It's on spreadsheets. All right. So, Troupe, kind of going back in time here a little bit. How did you even get into games audio in the first place? Whether it's compositions or sound design or anything else. Like, what? Can you give us a brief history of your past and what led you to Heart Machine?
Yeah. Both my parents are musicians, so I think that audio was sort of always um, the obvious path for me. But I think the games that is not something that I inherited from them.
Hmm.
My best friend and I, growing up, were really big Sonic the Hedgehog fans, and we were
Aren't we
looking
all?
for ways to to play more Sonic. And we found, I think when I was about 10 or so, we went online and we found somebody who had made a Sonic the Hedgehog fan game, and it was made using an engine called Verge, which was like a basically to make Super Nintendo style RPGs. And it was sort of this like revelation that you could not just play games but actually make them.
Hmm.
And that community was like really supportive, really cool group of people, many of whom we're still friends with. And basically from that point, I was about 10 or 11. We started just tinkering, and because I was, my parents were musicians, it was like, all right, you're going to be the music guy, and my friend did most of the art, and we both kind of tinkered on the programming side and everything else, and um, kind of never stopped really. I mean, at that point, uh, junior high, high school, that was basically what I was doing. I was playing in bands, and you know, um, for most of my 20s, I played in a band and had record deals and all that kind of stuff. But I was always paying the bills with game music, and kind of
Hmm.
always thinking like that's the sort of like where you're not going to be touring and playing shows in your 70s unless you're like wildly successful. So I kind of always knew that I would wind up leaning more heavily into game audio.
That,
Um,
that's interesting. Yeah, I think that's not always the case for a lot of folks because games are notoriously challenging to get into or even stay in longer term.
Yeah.
So thinking that like I'm going to be 75 and in games is definitely a little
That's my
different
goal.
end of the
We'll
spectrum, I
see.
think, from most folks'
Yeah.
attitudes.
I mean,
Um,
I think the main thing for me is like I really love creating, and so I think making records with the band. I actually made games within the context of the band, like for some of our music, sort of as like a music video game. Um, I've done, some film things and TV things, and to me, like creation as a whole is the end goal. And so, this is like a really special project, and my goal is to work on special projects kind of regardless of what they are. And so maybe at 75 it's not going to be games, but maybe it will be, or
it'll
maybe
be reality because
it'll be
games and
meta.
reality will merge by that time.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll all be Facebook by the time we're 70.
Exactly. Yeah, I'll be working for Facebook just like the rest of the world. Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing a bit on your background. I mean, I think it's helpful that your parents were also musicians and could probably provide some
Yeah.
context there. I come from a background where my parents didn't end up as artists professionally, but they were very much artists at heart. And so we're always
Yeah.
very encouraging creatively. And
Yeah.
in fact, my mother helped to teach me to draw and paint and other things like that. My dad taught me to sculpt, and it was a big advantage to have such a supportive crew. So I'm sure that was a big boon for you as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think growing up around, you know, it's just having instruments around, and hearing music and sort of knowing what the end goal is, like knowing what good audio is supposed to be, I think is something that is harder to teach later in life. Like I think having that innate understanding because your surroundings are just sort of like seeping into you, it was really helpful. So yeah, and yeah, just allowing me to pursue that career. Not that they were like super supportive of me dropping out of college, for example, but I think they were more
Hooray!
supportive than some people would be.
Standing ovation.
Yeah, but hey, it worked out. There were no game audio programs really when I was in college, so
Yeah.
there was just nothing to study really. I just started working.
In college, I didn't drop out, but I didn't technically graduate, even though I walked the line. So I think you and I we have a
Ah,
similar there.
nice.
Neither of us
Yeah,
have our degrees, at least.
exactly. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the important thing.
And I've never been asked for it in any context. No one
Nobody
has ever asked me
cares.
for my degree.
Nobody
That's
cares.
that's right.
That's the lesson of this stream: is that nobody will ask you for it.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Exactly right.
Well, why don't we get into some sharing? Because sharing is caring, so I've been told.
Yeah.
You brought along some clips here. Let's make sure that
Yeah.
we can see all this. We're gonna loop this
Ooh.
thing here. Let's play it. So in this clip, clip number one for us, I'm gonna let it kind of loop in the background. But
Yeah.
can you describe what's happening in here and why you felt
Yeah.
like sharing this one?
Yeah. So this is the the main challenge that we sort of faced on this project as a whole, but certainly with the audio team, um, is basically we're like too small of a team to make this game, and it's sort of uh, everything has to be very clever in order to make a game of this scale with a team of this size.
Hmm.
So this is something that we really kind of struggled with early on, where we were like, there's so many cool details in the world, right? Like there's foliage, there's stuff that's making sound, liquids, but to place all that by hand, with basically an audio team that's two people full time, um, was not going to be practical. So we built this very cool system, and this is a lot of people contributed to this. But Len White, our technical artist, did a lot of work on this, which basically places these vertices, points in space all around the world, and you can kind of use any rule set to place them. So in this case, it's finding trees, it's finding bushes, and then it's essentially doing a calculation to determine if you've got all these points around you, or say you've got all these points over there, then it's going to pan that sound. And so it's one single sound source that's being dictated by hundreds or thousands of these points in space. And what's so cool about it is all you do is when a level's done or a change happens, you regenerate the audio verts, and that's it. You never touch it again.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of those things that I see actually a lot on game audio communities, where people are like, how is everybody handling foliage? How is everybody handling liquids? It's like actually a really hard problem to solve.
Yeah.
And I feel like this was a really cool solution that took us, honestly, I think we were talking about how to do something like this for 6 months or maybe even a year. And finally kind of came up with something, and it's worked really well.
Well, part of it too is that we were using Unreal's out-of-the-box audio systems, correct? And there are other tools like Wise and FMod and things like that, but it was a concerted choice early on to kind of go with what was out of the box and then fill in the gaps that were missing, including systems like this that are more spatial and can kind of recognize the surroundings. And you touched on a point there about creating clever, smart systems for ourselves for a team of this scale, because it's not just the audio crew, especially in the early days when it was just Rich Vreeland, Disaster Piece, and then you came aboard at a certain point earlier on in the project, and then we brought AJ and etc. It was kind of a slow build over time, both on the people that we brought in and also the systems that were built out. And it was quite an effort to do all these things, as you were saying. Because again, like typically you'd use stuff that is already built, unless you had like a dedicated audio engineer or whatever. And none of you guys, however talented you are, like strictly engineers, you're all very brilliant and great, but this takes some doing on some form, in some form or another, especially to get it optimized. You can imagine having all these intersecting volumes and kind of doing searches for different arrays like this can be costly. And in fact, part of these systems that I would touch on too as we dig into them is just like the trials of it, not just conceptualizing, which took you guys 6 months, a year, and then to build it out. But then the true cost of it isn't really understood until later on, once you're starting to like dig into performance. Once design's locked in, once levels are clear, once you can have a section like this in the video that we're seeing here and be like, oh, right, how is it working? What do we need to do to refine it? And what do we need to do to make sure it runs on as many systems as we're targeting? So that's kind of like the full scope of it and scale of it isn't really well understood until much, much deeper into the project.
Yeah, and this and I think you can go to the next video, which is sort of same idea, but it's in the beach biome, where these are not just kind of cosmetic, like cool vibes. These are actually informing you about hazards that are dangerous to the character, which was something that was really important. So this is the acid audio birds.
It's very slooshy. It's got that low rumble to it, and you can see all the different volumes that are turning on as you get within a certain radius.
And I think that low rumble comes from those acid falls. So we've sort of got like the acid fall kind of like roar, and then there's little splashes at the bottom, and then the acid itself has the very splooshy, gloopy sounds. But it really, you can feel as you move around, and obviously I'm soloing this layer, but as you move around, like the world is very dynamic, and the world of the game is very dynamic, and because it's very fantastical, we really wanted it to feel grounded, so that players weren't sort of in a fantasy world that also didn't kind of react the way they expected. It's like we wanted it to feel real because it's so wild.
Yeah.
So it was, yeah, this system, speaking about optimization, our engineering lead, Jason, was, when we were talking about this, was like, well, all you care about is points in space. Like, computers are so good at crunching. I mean, you could have infinite points in space. And as soon as he said that, we were just like, all right, that's it. All right, Jason can never tell us this is not optimized enough,
Shut
because
it
he
down.
said we could do infinite points in space. And we really did. We just leveraged this system. I mean, I think there's something like 10 or 12 different types of audio verts all throughout the game, through all different kind of materials, and it was really performant.
I mean, are you all hand placing these volumes, or is it some sort of scatter that's going on with these, or is it recognizing?
So this is the thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Len made this incredible tool, as a technical artist, kind of, but also just engineer. He actually created a tool that even like it shoots up like ray casts from the surface of the acid. So like this acid is actually just a big plane, and then there's all this geo on top of it. And so you would have acid verts, sounds that were just sitting on this plane because, hey, there's acid there. But he actually built a tool that checks to see, is that acid actually exposed, or is there stuff on top of it? So it creates this perfect pattern that you're seeing here, where it's like all these are just perfectly placed only where there's visible acid. So that was a huge endeavor. I mean, Len did so much work on the system. I'm sure he'll do a GDC talk at some point.
Probably. It's interesting to, I think, point out that the amount of labor that goes into a system like this, and relatively speaking, how subtle it is as well. This isn't even, the sound on it is pretty low key in general. It's giving you hints, but it's not that explicit. And in fact, if you hadn't seen this video, you wouldn't really even know, what was happening. It's the great part about it is, it's invisible in a lot of ways. You don't sense, you don't see or get telegraphed like when it's going to happen. But I think it's a key point here about just the sheer amount of labor that goes into like the thought and the effort that goes into things like this that are, relatively speaking, subtle.
It's just all feels right, and that's the objective, I think, for audio, is that it isn't overt the vast majority of the time you're playing the game, because that becomes grating, and so these systems are layered, and we can look at the next couple systems, also fairly subtle, but when they do get turned off, a switch gets flipped somewhere, it's crazy how the experience is like, oh God, it's so empty, like, oh, the world doesn't feel reactive, like they really make a big difference.
It's true.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work for what is a little bit of payoff, but also a lot of payoff. A little bit in the sense that it's, again, relatively subtle, but when you take it away, you notice the absence quite a bit, and you don't have that level of polish. And to me, that's kind of the like key factor in games between like more high quality titles that you see or play and ones that didn't have as much put into it. It's like all these subtleties really stack up to build something greater than the sum of its parts, even. And you can like feel that quality. It's like it feels expensive in a lot of ways. Expensive in that wow, they clearly spent a lot of time like polishing aspects of this or focusing on the things that maybe aren't top of mind for every player. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's our job to look at the things that would not be top of mind for anyone else, and if we have the resources to do it, then it really does make a big difference. So yeah, if you want to look at the next one is one of the, so that's sort of like creating the world, and then there's doing stuff to be reactive to the player. So this is a wind system.
Let me see if I can turn this up.
Yeah, I tried to boost the.
Right. So you can kind of tell when Ray goes into a more enclosed area versus when she's outdoors, and even is there something going on with height even here?
Yeah. So the wind system is basically what you're seeing, that kind of debug printout, is that we're sending ray traces out in cardinal directions and above her, and basically getting
Those
sort
are
of
the
an
those are the
overall.
pink lines, correct?
Yeah, those are the pink lines are spinning around, the lasers coming from her head.
From her
And those
skull.
are basically telling us like how enclosed is the space that she's in. And if she's in a very enclosed space, if she's very low to the ground, if she's, you know, surrounded by land rather than being like on an edge, then we're not going to play that wind very, very loud. But when she gets like up here and hey, she's on this ledge, like she's on the precipice and it's wide open space, then we're driving that wind up, and it is, once again, it's a very subtle system, but when it's gone, it's the game sort of feels like static in a way,
Hmm.
and it really does a lot. And this is something that exists like basically the entire game. And we placed kind of regions throughout the game to say like, here's how high, here's what being like up high really means. So kind of everywhere in the game is tailored to maximize the impact of the system.
Hmm.
And it was one of the first things that I did, I think, kind of on the systems level. And it's held up for the entire game. The game has a lot of verticality,
It
and it makes
does.
it feel like special. And the alternative to this would be placing like wind regions. If it was a more linear game, we would sort of say, oh, this is a moment where the player goes out on this ledge.
Right.
But because it's so non-linear and sort of, I like basically from an audio perspective, it's an open world game. We don't know
Right.
where the player's coming from. We had to kind of get smart about creating those moments kind of procedurally.
Right. Well, it's you're creating a system to be reactive to the content rather than manually layering in layers of content.
Yeah, exactly.
That's redundant. Yeah.
And and then we didn't have to do much. When the levels were actually finalized, it was only like a half dozen assets or something that we had to make for, okay, this is like really a special, interior or whatever else. And for the most part, all those changes, like when you go into a building, it isn't like we, flipped a bunch of switches and we pulled a bunch of levers. Like the systems just react the way you sort of expect them to. And it goes for the music and stuff as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, it's all these things are subtle, but they really make the whole world kind of feel alive. So we can look at the next. I think the next one is actually maybe an old whoosh system video, which is very not subtle
Old whoosh.
in our initial implementation. I think that So
this is very old.
Max had a lot of old stuff, and I was well, I gotta have some old stuff too. So this is a test level that we built to demonstrate the system, which is once again sending out kind of lasers from the sides of Ray's head.
Yep.
And because the game is built on that sense of speed, that sense of fluidity, we felt like it was really important to have some sort of awareness where it felt like, you're actually moving fast past objects in the world. You don't get. I think the thing that is hard to express to people is like, you don't get anything for free in a game. Like everything has to be kind of generated, and you come up with your own laws of physics and everything. So you'd be moving super fast through the world, and it was just like, okay, you got this skating sound, that's kind of it. So this was a really fun way to get that sense of like, all right, stuff's whizzing by, especially in a third person game. You don't feel the like intensity as much.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this was one of the first things we were like, okay, we're really like leaning into as the game is coming together, and we're figuring out what the sort of the core features are going to be. We're actually kind of developing stuff to support that.
Ray was quite a bit slower in this also back in the day.
It's quite a bit slower. I mean, it's interesting too to see this and see how much the animation matters to how fast she feels, and like all these
VFX.
different. The VFX, like it's pretty fun to look back at this.
The FOV in particular, when you have a larger FOV with kind of that fisheyeing in the periphery, it'll amplify the feeling of speed quite a bit. And so that's one of the other visual tricks. But as a person who cares a lot about audio myself and has dabbled in all of those things and feels like audio is just as much a crucial part of the experience as any of the other aspects of this. You can make a gun, like a shotgun in a game, feel so much more powerful purely from
Right.
the audio that you layer onto it. Animations aside, or any of the VFX or even the weaponry itself, it's like a lot of that impact comes down to sound design in many, many ways. So, and
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things in games that I think don't appreciate as much when people talk about games typically, or awards are given out or whatever else. Like, yeah, sure, we do recognize it to some extent, but I think it's such an essential part of that experience and feel, and especially when we're talking about interactivity, not just linear media. We're talking about something that has an experience, that has impact, and there are very few ways to let the player feel that impact, because we can't smell things in games. We can see and hear them, and we can feel them through vibration, depending on the controller you're using and settings you're using. But other than that, it's like, well, what other types of feedback are you getting for your senses? And audio kind of substitutes a bit, not just for hearing things, but also that like vibration and the bass and those other elements of like actually like feeling things on your skin or in your bones or whatever else.
I think it's substituting, in the example of like the acid or things like that. It's sort of whatever smell, whatever like temperature that you might feel from, fire or lava or things like that you're not getting. Audio is sort of doing that work. And then VFX as well, like heat distortion and things like that. But the sort of ambient experience of being in a place, I think, ends up being a lot of that heavy lifting is on audio.
Yep.
So that's why we put extra effort into that stuff, because there's not many ways to express it without creating, too crazy visual chaos for trying to, do too much on that side. So that we have the room for the sweetener. I think you can actually skip the next one if you want, and we can talk about. We can, we can just do it real quick. But this is basically the system as it is in the game. So this is the music stuff, and this is the phrase manager system, which basically is getting a bunch of data about the world, and it's playing these little musical snippets based on if there are enemies nearby, if you're skating on clouds, if you are grinding on rails, if you're jumping off a ledge, standing somewhere high up. And so this was something to sort of, when we started realizing the game was kind of like really open world to an extent, from an audio perspective, we realized that we needed something that was reactive and didn't overburden the player with repetitive music loops. Like if they're exploring, that they're not going to feel like, I've heard this a million times. So this was something I'm really proud of. I built this basically myself, and it took a lot of iteration to have all of the different elements kind of smoothly transition to each other and not feel too heavy-handed. So we can listen when it loops. We can listen to a little bit how these things come together. And there's a bed of music that starts playing when anytime a phrase plays, and the phrases always kind of float on top of that bed of music, so that it feels consistent. So you'll see when you approach this guy, you get sort of pre-combat music, and then during combat music, and when you leave the encounter, you get post-combat music. And there's all these sort of emotional, like, just little cues of like, okay, it's okay now, you can relax a little bit.
Well, you mentioned you guys have been calling it like the phrasing system, right? Can you describe why phrasing, what that means, and how that relates to what we're hearing and seeing here?
Yeah. So basically the idea is, rather than creating like a linear piece of music and doing fades or layers or things like that we're actually taking chunks of music, which we call phrases, and sort of like melodic phrase or a couple chords, and we tried to keep them very minimalist so that they didn't really like stick out. It was more like they evoked an emotion. And so basically we're taking these phrases and we're saying like, all right, here's a random pool of like pre-combat phrases, and then you're in combat, and we're going to do this sort of combat phrase, and then you leave combat, and we'll do the post-combat phrase. And these are all distinct chunks. They're not like, they weren't composed together, but they all fit together in the same key. So it's basically like it's stitching an overall musical arc, and it might be a minute, or it might only be 20 seconds. But that arc sort of has like a beginning, middle, and end. And it comes in kind of subtly, it goes away subtly, and you, as a player, it's like, you don't necessarily think like, oh, I'm hearing the combat cue. It's not like, dun, 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 but it sort of evokes the right emotion based on what's happening around you. And it's getting tons of data to drive the system, like how long you've been skating on clouds, or what the threat level is nearby, how high up in the level you are, like all these different parameters. And I think it works really well. It's one of those things that there's like no other, as a musician, there's nothing I've ever made that is anything like this. It basically allows you to kind of create your own soundtrack.
Right, it's highly dynamic. It's reactive rather than being a very static or linear piece of composition, music that you make. And certainly there are other games that do dynamic systems like this, but the fact that you all, like you and Rich and other folks, created something like this in Unreal rather than getting out of the box tools is in and of itself quite a feat.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I think you always have to customize any systems like this to the game, and that's one of the things we learned as the sort of gameplay of this game came together, because it is a very original game. Like, there's just no reference points for the types of things that you're doing and the way you're doing them, and we really realized like it doesn't feel right in this game if the music isn't reactive in some way. But even then, some of the systems that we came up with earlier, which we'll get to next, it's like even that level of reactivity, which is pretty substantial, wasn't enough. So we basically were always seeking that like next level of reactivity. And I think it really does feels really fluid musically to play through this game in the same way that the character controller is really fluid.
Well, let's go to the next one.
Yeah, this is the beach, and this is the group playback control system, which basically syncs however many layers, could be 5, could be 10, of music. And these are individual stems, so like drums, bass, synthesizers, whatever. And each of those layers, they're all started and stopped at the same time. But as you move through the world, they get changed dynamically, and they get filtered, or the volume goes up and down. They get reverb sends and things like that. So as you'll hear, when you get into combat or when you move quickly, the music kind of pushes and pulls and expresses what the player's doing.
So it's kind of picking up the pace. It's getting growly when there's enemies around.
Yeah. And we sort of wanted to, like, Rich made this joke early on of like, oh yeah, so you need like combat drums? We can't just do straight up combat drums, which is a very classic thing where you have like, you've got your music stem, and then when
put
you
your layer, you fade your layer on.
The drums come in. And so we really wanted to do something that was a lot more organic feeling, where it wasn't necessarily just like, okay, drums come in. And so we have, a lot of layers that are, sure, they happen in combat, but they also happen if you're moving quickly, or they happen, we can even dictate different areas of the level and basically say like, hey, when you're in this zone, let's actually bring some of that bass in kind of all the time, because there's like a little bit more tension in the entire area. So it gives us so much control basically over the way that the world feels kind of as you move through it.
I mean, how long does it take to not just develop a system like this, because we've touched upon that a little bit, but once you have the actual system itself, to continue to develop and layer things on in an area
Yeah.
like this? You know, what's the process
Yeah.
like for that? How challenging is that?
Yeah, so this is a real. I did all of these, all of this music for this system across the game because it is basically impossible to compose. Like it's truly miraculous that that we ended up with anything because having to keep track of, say there's like 10 layers. There's 10 layers of music that could be played at any time in any combination. So you're looking at like the sort of the linear time of the music just being, okay, it's 1 minute into the music, 2 minutes into the music. Then you're looking at the sort of the player's time in the space and what's going on around them sort of in 3D space. It becomes like a very like 5D, like, oh my God, it's like so hard to, imagine what's going on here. So it really took a lot of iteration. And I think early on, you and I went back and forth a lot, in like some of the earlier levels to find the right tone. And I'm honestly like amazed that we were even able to like talk about this music, that you had opinions that could get the music closer to what we were looking for, because it's so hard to evaluate when it's this like kind of
organic.
dynamic. Yeah, it's this organic. So it really, it's a lot of work. I mean, I think each environment took, I would say, probably like a month of, like throughout the project, like a month of my time in terms of like composing, doing all the implementation, and every level is different, has different mechanics. So, this level has like Wilkways, and this other one will have spore threads, and the player's doing different things in each level.
Right.
So creating all that music and then implementing it and having it work with the ambiences and all the gameplay systems and everything was about a month, maybe more, per level. So it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's quite a bit of work. And
Yeah,
then that
and so
doesn't
the
even
final-
account for, the redos or the bugs or any of the other troubleshooting that had to occur
Right.
throughout optimizations and et cetera.
Yeah, that's purely just like getting the stuff in the game, and the complexity of the game and the number of like different verbs the player has, within each space means there's all sorts of other interactions with other systems, other blueprints. Like there's a lot going on, and all of those things are driven by sort of one like master blueprint, which is essentially like Unreal's like version of a code repository. And that's just running everything. Like it's running all the environment sounds, it's running all the music, it's switching between the music systems, and it's really empowering how much you can do. Like there's a lot in there, even though it's we're talking about like a month. Actually, the amount of work that we were able to put into that is pretty amazing. Like I'm really proud of the way all the systems came together and all the work that Rich did, that AJ did. That everybody like put a lot of love into these spaces. So
Sure.
I feel really good about the detail we have in there. Yeah.
Well, let's dig into this monster.
Yeah. This is almost like a gag.
Ooh.
This is the session for the first boss track in the game, and this is a piece of software called Renoise, which is a tracker. It's a specific type of music making tool that started in like the Amiga, basically, Commodore 64. It is how I started making music because it was a free tool. There were free trackers back in the day, and a lot of video games like original Unreal Engine used this format. Still what I do. And so I kind of wanted to just show people that people ask a lot about software and like, oh, what tools do you have? And, what do you use? This is the tool that I use, and it's very goofy.
Is it still free?
Like this. Renoise is, I'm trying to remember how much Renoise is. I think it's like $200 or something. It's a pretty, considering, Pro Tools is like thousands, Renoise is a good deal. And there are other trackers that are actually pretty full featured. Mod plug tracker is what I use that was free. That are a great way to start. But I don't necessarily recommend getting into it unless it's your bag.
Right.
But,
unless you grew up playing with these types of tools.
Yeah, exactly.
Or, I think trackers versus what is more popular these days, they're different types of tools in a lot of ways. Certain ways of concepting can happen quicker in tracking versus more, popular methods these days with GarageBand in Logic and all those things that again are the more familiar horizontal track that you stack layers onto versus this type of system, which is pretty wild. So let's listen to it for a moment.
Yeah.
Well, that's a tracker.
There you go.
I really appreciate that you followed the instruments so you could, showcase and highlight what was happening there, because there's so much information every moment here when you're kind of going through this program. I know you've been doing it for a while and using software like this for a while, but how difficult does it become to keep track of all the different elements in something like this, where it becomes more complicated and layered?
Yeah, it is. It is actually really hard. And the boss fights, we went back and forth on like how much layering should happen. I think this one is just the percussion's broken out 2 different layer, but it's really like the style, the aesthetic that we sort of landed on for this game was sort of you had talked about like Mario Galaxy and stuff early on, like that really like expensive, like nice kind of orchestral vibe. But of course, Hard Machine games have that experimental, very like pushed kind of synthetic aesthetic. So we were always trying to kind of ride that line of having, and that's why I was trying to show the different layers, is like, look, there's a weird synth that you kind of don't really perceive that's doing the same thing as like the trumpets or the French horn or the violin, but it adds to that sort of sense of otherworldliness. And so tracking all of those things, trying to, oh, right, I've got to, if this violin's going to do it, I've got to make sure that synth does it as well, is definitely a lot of work. And these boss tracks were a lot of work as well.
Right. But they took many months for each of the bosses, and it was a concerted effort. You and I went back and forth on a lot of different feedback on different ways to express the overall feeling of the creature itself, its kind of emotional core. And that's a challenging thing to talk about, to interpret, to express then in an audio format. We later on we brought in Sky, Lou, and Joel to help finish out some of these tracks that just hadn't gotten any attention, and they did a pretty incredible job. They don't use trackers quite like this. They have their own versions of things that
more civilized,
more civilized in a lot of ways. But it's fascinating to see what this kind of software can do, and just like the sheer amount of like labor that goes into just a single track. And this is one of our more linear tracks. We were just talking about all these dynamic systems, and like you and Rich and Len and other folks on the engineering side, and like built systems, like entire wild systems for. Keep hitting my mic.
Right.
But now we're looking at what it takes to just do a more
Make a
straightforward song,
Yeah.
like a composition from start to finish, and like even then, it's quite a bit. And also, the other aspect of this that I think that's worth asking you to talk about for a moment is just that kind of blending between more traditional instruments, orchestration, and kind of these synths and other wild sounds we have in there. I think Rich picked out a particular instrument that kind of became an identifier for us, like a part of the character of the sound. What was that instrument?
Yeah, that instrument is the Skiddaw stones, which I think it's like a British thing, maybe, or somewhere in Europe, where basically somebody had made this huge, it's essentially like a xylophone, but with like giant stones that are, you know, like this big, and you hit it with mallets, and it has this it's almost like bone-like kind of tone to it. And Rich, early on, you know, he and I were both doing a lot of different sketches. I think I really stumbled onto the Boss aesthetic pretty early. Like, I kind of first pass that I did at the Bosses, we felt like was kind of the right thing, but I didn't really find like the environment music vibe for quite a while. And I think Rich did a sketch where he had used those Skiddaw stones, and both of us were like, "That's cool. What's that thing?"
Yeah.
And it kind of became I always like to include, even if people don't notice it, I always like to include sort of themes, motifs, like aesthetic limitations, because I think it helps. It's subtle, but I think it helps like establish the vibe. And so for the Skiddaw stones, I think I used it in basically all of the like level music and stuff that we've looked at.
Yeah. I remember
Skiddaw stones somehow.
I remember the track that had been put together and that we were talking about, and I was like, "What is that? That sounds great." And that seems like we should focus on that thing.
Yeah, and it's a cool sound. It's like it's a real sound, but it's not anything that you would hear on a regular basis. And I think Joel Corlitz, who you mentioned earlier, who's been helping us kind of get over the finish line with the music. He worked on Death Stranding, and the first like month or something that they worked on it, they were just like smashing pianos and like banging instruments and doing weird stuff to just kind of like acquire those sounds, because a lot of times like synthesizers will get you a good way there, but you want some level of like organic, you want like a reality to the sounds. And so that was the thing that we sort of were always pushing for, is like kind of some traditional sounds, some very pushed like organic real sounds, and then some purely synthetic sounds, so that the Ultra Void felt like it had sort of its own genre that was not anything on Earth, basically.
Right, because it's not. Well, Troupe, this was very educational and very cool to see behind the scenes stuff about your process on this application that I still can't believe that you use, and make
it's cool.
Make the things that happen with it, and to kind of pull back some of the layers on what it took to dig into the systems made for this game, and just in general the process that a lot of audio folk go through on larger games as well. Like, there's a lot of commonalities here just in the dynamics that are being achieved in a lot of different modern games as well. Again, there are tools that are out of the box that help to get there without having to do the audio engineering, but I think every game has the level, of they have their own bar internally that they want to achieve, and I think we've been able to hit a pretty high bar with everybody on the audio crew and the engineers that helped really elevate this even further and make sure it was performant. Like that whole like from start to finish process is quite a thing to behold for the audio side for a game like this, and for the ambitions that we had for it. So
I think at least half the team has touched some audio stuff like directly, if not more. Like almost every engineer has optimized something for us, or helped us put a system together. So it's an absolutely a group effort beyond the audio team. Right. And I'm really proud of the work that everyone did. And they basically we managed to kind of get everything we wanted to get in there. So, I'm excited for people to experience it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. I think it's time for us to talk to people on our chat and get some questions and answers out there for folks to kind of have a good send off here. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna leave this wild application video running in the background while we discuss any questions that come up. So, all right, let's scroll back here. Questions from folks. All right, what's the most difficult thing about sound design? Says that WA guy. What is the most difficult thing about it?
I think the most difficult thing about sound design is that no sound is objectively correct or objectively good. It's only good in the context of other sounds.
I
think
object.
that's very, it's very difficult to, when you have a project of this scale and this scope, it's easy to make a sound that is perfect when it's in your DAW, it's in your software and you're like, God, it sounds incredible. And then you put it in the game, and because of what happens right before it or what happens right next to it, it doesn't work at all, or it's way too big, or it's way too small. So I think that that's kind of not necessarily true of some other disciplines. You can be like, well, this is clearly good. It looks amazing. It's fine. Sound is very, very contextual. So that's the thing I feel like I see people struggle with, and I struggle with as well, the most.
Mm-hmm. That's a fair point. I think Alex Johnson, who joined us, later in the project and became our primary sound designer for sound effects and kind of ambiences and other things like that. His just observing his process has been really interesting too, and understanding all the different fiddly bits and knobs that need to be turned around to just modulate anything to sound like anything at all. Because it can be so far off, unless you're recording true to life things. But when you're in a like sci-fi fantasy style game, you don't really necessarily want true to life sounds. You want to create your own soundscape to match the aesthetic and match the overall vibe here. And it's similar to what we did with Drifter, when it was just a Rich Freeland disaster piece and Akash Thakar, who did a lot of that, a lot of SFX for that. It was trying to create an aesthetic, trying to create a world through sound that matches the visuals of everything of the experience, and that needed some grounding in reality, but also needed to be pushed into another dimension and be entirely our own thing to give it its clear identity. So it's a pretty wild thing to do, and to observe, make this all come to life. So
the team definitely sent us a lot of messages about did you guys make this crazy thing? And it's very fun that it feels like it's a little bit like wizardry. Nobody really understands how we're making these giant beast sounds, and it's just experimentation, finding it.
Games development is wizardry. Okay, so is Renoise the main software for the soundtrack, or are there other DAWs or middleware? Asks Captain Tables.
Renoise, the majority of the music in this game was made in Renoise, yes. But I think, I'm not sure what Joel uses, or Rich even. But Logic is probably what was used for other stuff. I think the number of tools that have been used on this project is honestly quite wide-ranging. When AJ joined, Alex Johnson, our sound designer, he was using Pro Tools, and then he switched to Reaper because that's what I was using. And so everybody's used, and I use Reaper for stuff as well.
I just like the name of Reaper, even if it's kind of a bonkers program.
It's grim. As they say.
The pain. Okay. Azuria Sky. Hello, Sky. Sky asks, does Renoise have an instrument limit?
Not that I've ever encountered. And as you see from that that video, I'm using a lot of instruments. So I'm going to say no, or it's could be 255 or something, but I've basically hit no limitations on Renoise except bringing computers to their knees because I'm using too many plugins and stuff.
Yeah,
But
what was the
that's not even.
maximum number of instruments you've ever used, not just on this project, but in your life in this program?
It's probably under 100. Well, it's probably like 100, I would say. Yeah. So I I'm pretty maximalist, and I don't ever run up against those kind of limitations. So go for it. Somebody find out. Somebody push it and see what happens. Let me know.
Uh, I think Celia is disappointed if there are no clips of people smashing things to make cool sound effects, which I agree. I'm also disappointed.
Yeah, I
Um,
did not film myself doing any of that process. I think because of the pandemic, we were basically working in isolation, so there was nobody really to film me smashing things. I was just recording myself smashing. So
um, it's interesting about the differences, on the audio side, working together in the audio room in the old studio that we
yeah,
had, and then in the new audio room here at the studio that I'm at right now, which nobody else is at because it's that
mhm.
times pandemic, and kind of the differences where we can kind of collaborate together during the day in a more just spur of the moment, hear whatever we need to hear kind of fashion, and hear it on
Yeah,
good hardware without any like crushing compression from the stream versus
yeah.
the kinds of things that we have to do here. Uh, had the transition been tough for you, considering that you and Rich were working together pretty closely for many months before the
Yeah,
pandemic hit?
I think the timing was really good where we did a lot of sessions where, we would be at the studio for like 14 hours and we'd leave and like both of our brains would just be totally melted because we were doing all this crazy like 3D math spatialization, like, oh my God, what does it mean if the user is here and then they hear this thing and which ear is it coming from? And we were using whiteboards and a lot of that collaboration was sort of the foundation for the systems that we built, like the lower level stuff. And we basically finished it, and then the pandemic happened. So we just came in like right under the gun there, where we had
Mm,
just barely kind of put it all to bed. And then I think it would have been great. I think it's actually now is when it's really sad that we can't be in the same room because I think
right,
playing the game and hearing it in context and being like, yeah, that what was that thing? Like, could we
right.
just turn that up a little bit? Is so much easier than like making individual lists and
Yeah.
cross-referencing.
Well, we just
So
we just did some sessions last week about like kind of the audio levels or the mix overall,
mhm.
the different systems and how to balance stuff out.
Yeah,
And it's not the same as being in the
yeah,
same room together and saying, "Hey,
yeah.
that
They're
sound
not hearing the
there."
same thing.
Right. It's
Yeah,
like, well, I have to
like
describe this while you stream something, and then hope
yeah,
that I hear it in the right way, and then you hear it
yeah.
also. And
Your speakers are the same as my speakers, or
right, it's
headphones are
like
the same
different
as mine.
audio setups, different levels, and again, like the crushing of the audio through Discord and all that stuff. It's just
Yeah,
it's a strange process, but um, we made it work somehow,
yeah.
some way. Okay, uh, BK or Beck VD. BK Vid, I'm gonna say. How do you make an OST for a game with an extensive sound design like this?
Yeah, I have no idea how we're gonna do the OST is the answer to that question. Like, it- there is no like definitive version of a lot of these tracks. Like something like the boss track, that's playing right now is like you can just render it and it's fine. But
Yeah,
the layered stuff where you've got like 10 layers that are kind of programmatically generated, uh, maybe you or I will just play through the game with the music soloed and be like,
perhaps.
okay, there it is. That's a
Right.
version. Uh, or maybe I'll kind of build it. I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I think what's cool is like ultimately the experience in the game is actually the definitive experience,
It
and
is.
that is embracing what makes video games special. So I'm even though it's complex and I'm not exactly sure how we're going to approach it, I'm very happy that the music exists in its best form in the context of the game.
Yeah, I remember one of Rich's early goals that he and I talked about when we were first discussing Solar Ash way back when, more than 5 years ago at this point, His kind of goal, generally speaking, he can. I'd love to get him here on a stream sooner than later to talk more about his process and kind of the audio engineering side and the things that he did. But I think the ambition there was like almost to make a soundtrack that was impossible to, or a game that was impossible to have a soundtrack for, because it was so reactive and dynamic. There would be no like real actual version of this that made sense, but I think it evolved. It evolved quite a bit through all these different dynamic systems and the realities of gameplay and level design and the constraints that came with all that stuff, and funneling it into something that still, as you can see from the past 40 minutes that we've been digging into stuff, is incredibly dynamic. And even though it's more understandable, still is going to be a big challenge to get into a sound actual like OST.
We achieved like 50% of Rich's goal, and I think we sort of moved in that direction where, say Hyperlight is relatively easy to make an OST for. This game is quite hard. Maybe we're moving towards that sort of it's totally impossible goal. But I think we struck a good balance on this project, and I'm really happy with, the game, and then we'll figure out the OST when we finish the game.
Yeah.
Which is very, very close. We're going to start thinking about it very soon.
It is very close. All right. I think we're hitting our time limit here. It's past 4:00. Trying to keep these streams kind of more concise lately. So also we got a video game to ship out. So we got to get back to it. But thanks to everybody who sat with us and watched, and thanks for the questions as well. We're going to keep doing these things. We're going to have more folks from Art Machine, and now that we're kind of out of the woods in a lot of ways with our shipping mode, like, hey, we're still not done yet. Comes out December 2nd, remember. But we have an hour here or there to do things like this, so want to try and continue to do these things on a regular basis, on more of a weekly basis. So we'll let folks know what's next, maybe next week or the week after, but we'll try and do it more regularly. But thanks everybody for coming in here and hanging out. I'll count it down. I'll see y'all later. 3, 2, 1. Goodbye.